Every great city needs a heart. This heart must beat strongly to give life to the people around it. In the year 1800, New York City was searching for its heart. The city was growing fast. Ships from all over the world sailed into the harbor. People walked the busy streets. They bought goods and sold their wares. But the government of the city had no proper home. The leaders worked in a building that was too old and too small. It was a problem that needed a solution. The story of New York City Hall is the story of how the city built this heart. At the turn of the 19th century, New York City was not the giant metropolis we know today. It was a town of about 60,000 people. The streets were narrow and dirty. There were no tall skyscrapers touching the clouds. The tallest buildings were churches. But the city felt important. It was the capital of the United States for a short time. It was a center of trade. However, the seat of the city government did not match this growing importance. The city leaders met in a building called City Hall. It stood on Wall Street and Nassau Street. This building had a long history. It was built in the year 1703. That was almost 100 years before our story begins. The British had used it. The colonial government had used it. After the American Revolution, the building became Federal Hall. This is where George Washington took the oath of office to become the first president. It was a historic place. But history does not keep a building standing. Time and weather do the work of destruction. By the year 1800, the old City Hall was falling apart. The walls were cracking, the roof leaked when it rained, the floors creaked under the feet of the aldermen. It was a place of dignity, but it was also a place of decay. The smell of damp wood filled the rooms. The windows rattled in the wind. The space inside was too small for the growing government. There were too many offices and not enough rooms. The courts needed space. The mayor needed a proper office. The records of the city needed a safe place to stay. The old building could not provide these things. The city faced a big challenge. They needed a new city hall. But building a new building is never easy. It costs a lot of money. It requires a plan. It requires land. In 1800, the city did not have extra money to spend. The people of the city paid taxes, but there was never enough. The government had to be careful with every penny. They could not afford to build something that looked like a palace. They had to be practical, but they also wanted something beautiful. They wanted a building that would make New York City look important to the world. There was another problem. Where should they build it? The city was crowded at the southern tip of Manhattan. This area was known as the Lower East Side. Land there was very expensive. If the city bought land in the center of town, they would have to pay a fortune. They needed to find a different place. The leaders looked north. They looked at a piece of land called the Common. The Common was a large open area. It was used as a parade ground. Soldiers practiced their drills there. Villagers brought their cows and sheep to graze on the grass. It was a place for fairs and public meetings. But it was far from the main business district. In those days, most people lived and worked south of the Common. Building the new city hall there was a risk. It meant the government believed the city would grow northward. It was a bet on the future. The Common was not a beautiful park at that time. It was a rough, open space. There were paths, but they were dusty in summer and muddy in winter. There was a jail nearby called the Bridewell. There was a poorhouse. It was not a peaceful setting. But the land belonged to the city already. This was the biggest advantage. They did not have to buy the land. They could use the money they saved on the construction of the building. The Common Council is the group of men who ran the city. They debated the idea for a long time. Some men wanted to stay in the old building and fix it up. This would be cheaper. But other men argued that a patch-up job would not last. They wanted a new structure that would last for centuries. In the end, the vision of the future won. The council voted to build a new city hall on the Common. Now they had to find the money. The cost was estimated to be a huge sum. The city did not have the cash. They came up with a clever plan. They decided to sell water lots. These were plots of land along the waterfront that were underwater at high tide. The city sold these lots to wealthy merchants. The merchants would fill in the land with dirt and rocks. Then they could build docks and warehouses on the new land. This sale raised the money needed for the new city hall. It was a smart way to pay for the project without raising taxes on the people. With the land selected and the money secured, the next step was the design. The city leaders wanted the best building possible. They did not want to pick a design themselves. They wanted architects to compete. They announced a contest. This was a common practice in the Old World, but new in America. They invited builders and architects to submit their plans. The notice went out in the newspapers. It asked for a design that was grand and convenient. The response was slow at first. Then the drawings started to arrive. The council members looked at many different plans. Some were too simple. They looked like plain boxes. Others were too fancy. They would cost too much to build. The council rejected many ideas. They wanted a building that was majestic but within the budget. They wanted a building that represented the values of the new American Republic. It should be strong. It should be rational. It should be beautiful. The competition drew the attention of two men. Their names were John McComb, Jr. and Joseph Francois Mangin. These two men would become the key figures in our story. They were very different people. John McComb, Jr. was born in New York. He was the son of a builder. He knew the city well. He had already designed important buildings. He built the Montauk Point Lighthouse. He worked on the Grace Church. He was a practical man. He knew how to make stone stand tall. He was an American architect. Joseph Francois Mangin was different. He was an immigrant. He came from France. He arrived in the United States in the late 1990s. He was a trained engineer and architect. He had a talent for drawing and a sharp mind for geometry, but he was new to the city. He did not have the deep roots that McComb had. Mangin had also worked on a famous project. He helped create the map that laid out the grid of streets for New York City. This map would guide the city's growth for a long time. Mangin understood the layout of the land. McComb and Mangin decided to work together. They combined their skills. Mangin was the artist. He drew the elegant lines. He designed the shapes and curves. McComb was the builder. He made sure the design would stand up. He calculated the loads and the stresses. They worked as a team. They submitted their plan to the Common Council. They called it simply the design for the new City Hall. Their plan was different from the others. Most buildings in America at that time were plain. They were made of red brick or wood. They looked like simple houses, just bigger. But the design by McComb and Mangin was bold. It was inspired by the grand buildings of Europe. It looked like a Greek temple or a Roman palace. It had columns and arches. It had a high dome. It was designed to face south, towards the harbor. This would catch the sunlight. The council members looked at the drawings. They were impressed, but they were also worried. The design looked expensive. It called for a lot of stone. It called for intricate carvings. The council had a strict budget. They feared the architects would run out of money before the roof was on. There was a lot of discussion. Some members wanted to change the design. They wanted to use cheaper materials. The architects stood by their plan. They argued that the building should be made of marble. There was a marble quarry in Westchester County, north of the city. The stone was white and strong. They said marble would last forever. Brick would crumble. Wood would rot. Marble would stand as a testament to the city's greatness. The council listened. They debated the costs. They looked at the beauty of the design. In the year 1802, the judges made their decision. They awarded the prize to McComb and Mangin. Their design was the winner, but the victory came with a catch. The council did not hire the architects to run the whole job alone. They appointed John McComb, Jr. as the superintendent of the construction. They gave him the main control. They did not give Mangin a clear title. Mangin was listed as the co-architect, but McComb was the one in charge of the work. This decision would cause trouble later. The choice of McComb to lead the project makes sense in some ways. He was the local man. He knew the workers. He knew the suppliers. He knew how to deal with the city officials. But Mangan was the one who drew the plans. He was the artistic mind behind the marble curves. By pushing Mangan to the side, the council planted a seed of controversy. Who really created New York City Hall? Was it the practical American builder or the French immigrant artist? This question would linger for many years. Now the city had a plan. They had a place to build. They had the leaders to guide the work. The atmosphere was filled with hope. The people of New York read about the new building in the newspapers. They wanted to see their city grow up. They wanted a grand symbol of their progress. But hope does not lay stones. Hope does not carve marble. The hard work was about to begin. The ground on the common was not ready. It was uneven. The soil was soft in some places. The builders had to prepare the foundation. This is the most important part of any building. If the foundation is weak, the building will fall. The architects knew this. They planned to dig deep. They planned to place large stones in the earth to support the weight of the marble walls. The location of the building was also carefully chosen. They did not put it in the center of the open common. They placed it at the northern edge. This was a strategic move. By placing it there, they created a large open space in front of the building. This space became a public plaza. It framed the building. It allowed people to stand back and see its full height. It made the city hall look grander. This design choice showed wisdom. They were not just building a government office. They were creating a public space for the people. The decision to use marble was a bold statement. Most public buildings in America at that time used brownstone or brick. Marble was rare. It was difficult to cut and shape. It was heavy to transport. The marble from Westchester had to be brought down the Hudson River on barges. Then it had to be carted through the streets to the building site. This was a slow and expensive process. But the city leaders insisted on quality. They wanted the building to be white and shining. The year was 1803. The quiet days of the common were over. The sound of the first shovels striking the earth marked the beginning of a long era. This was not just digging for a basement. It was the digging of a foundation for a new era in New York. The workmen arrived early in the morning. The sun rose over the small city. The air was crisp. The men carried their tools. They had pickaxes, spades, and wheelbarrows. They were ready to turn the paper drawings into a reality. The work began with the removal of the earth. The ground had to be leveled. The spot chosen for the building was not perfectly flat. The crews dug deep trenches. They went down until they hit solid bedrock. This was hard work. The soil was a mix of clay and loose rocks. The men sweated in the sun and shivered in the wind. They had to remove the dirt by hand. There were no steam shovels. There were no trucks. Just men, horses, and simple carts. It took many months just to prepare the ground. Once the trenches were dug, the stonework began. The foundation required huge blocks of stone. These blocks had to be perfect. If one stone was not level, the wall above it would be weak. The masons checked every row. They wanted the walls to stand straight for 100 years. The plans called for a magnificent material. The building was to be clad in white marble. This was a grand idea, but finding the marble was a challenge. The architects looked for a source nearby. They found it in a place called Sing Sing. It is now known as Ossining. It is a town on the Hudson River, about 30 miles north of the city. There were large marble quarries there. The stone was white and pure. It was perfect for the new city hall. Getting the marble to the city was a major operation. There were no trains or highways. The only highway was the Hudson River. Workers cut the massive blocks of marble in the quarries. They loaded them onto heavy barges. Horses pulled the barges down the river. The journey took time. The current helped, but the wind and the tides often fought against the boats. When the barges reached the city, they docked at the wharves. From the wharves, the stone had to travel to the common. This was a difficult trip through the city streets. The streets were narrow and crowded. The surfaces were rough cobblestones or dirt roads. The weight of the marble was immense. The teamsters used heavy wagons pulled by teams of strong horses. The wheels creaked under the load. The streets shook. It was a slow procession. One block could take an hour to move. But the stone had to get there. There was no other way. As the walls began to rise, a controversy started to grow. It was a controversy about money and appearance. The city leaders had a budget. They wanted the front of the building to look grand. This was the face the city would show to the world. The south front faced the city center. It would be made of the fine white marble from Sing Sing. But the council looked at the cost. They worried the money would run out. They made a decision that changed the building forever. They ordered the architects to use a different stone for the back and the sides. This stone was brownstone. It came from quarries in New Jersey and Connecticut. Brownstone is a type of sandstone. It is easier to cut. It was cheaper, and it was readily available. The council thought this was a smart compromise. They would have the marble look where it mattered. The rest of the building would be brown. This decision created a two-faced building. The front is a gleaming white palace. The back is a reddish-brown structure. This became a unique feature of New York City Hall. It was a sign of the practical nature of the city. They wanted beauty, but they would not pay for beauty on all sides. The builders went to work with the two types of stone. They laid the white marble on the front facade. They laid the brownstone on the rear. The construction process was slow. The walls grew inch by inch. The workers built scaffolding around the site. These were wooden platforms. They allowed the men to reach the higher parts of the walls. Working high above the ground was dangerous. There were no safety harnesses. One slip could mean a fall to the ground below. The workers had to be careful. They trusted their balance and their skill. While the walls rose, the relationship between the two architects began to crumble. John McComb Jr. was the superintendent. He was on the site every day. He talked to the masons, he checked the bills, he managed the money. Mangan was not as visible. He had drawn the plans, but the city council gave most of the power to McComb. Mangan felt pushed aside. Mangan was a proud man. He believed he was the genius behind the design. He saw his beautiful curves and his grand ideas being changed by practical concerns. He thought the city did not respect his talent. There were arguments. There were disagreements about how to interpret the drawings. McComb focused on making the building stand up. Mangan focused on making it look right. The tension between the two men hung over the construction site like a cloud. In the year 1807, the construction hit a snag. The building was taking longer than planned. The budget was getting tight. The city council was worried. They held meetings to discuss the delays. They asked for reports. They wanted to know why the walls were not finished. McComb had to explain the difficulties. He talked about the bad weather. He talked about the delays in getting stone. He promised to speed up the work. The council also questioned the design. They looked at the plans for the cupola. This is the small dome that sits on top of the roof. It was a complex shape. It required a lot of skilled carpentry and ironwork. The council feared it would cost too much. They asked the architects to simplify it. They wanted to save money. McComb and Mangan had to change the design. They made the cupola less elaborate than the original drawing. This was a blow to Mangan's artistic vision, but it was necessary to finish the building. Despite the money troubles, the building started to look impressive. The white marble front glowed in the sunlight. It stood out against the blue sky. The columns at the entrance were taking shape. They were made of single pieces of stone. These columns were massive. It took great strength just to move them into position. The columns represented the strength of the Republic. They were solid and unmoving. Inside the building, a different kind of magic was happening. The workers created the rotunda. This is a large circular space inside the center of the building. It is topped by a dome. Building a dome is one of the hardest tasks in architecture. The weight of the dome pushes outward on the walls. If the walls are not strong enough, they will burst outward. The builders used thick arches to carry the weight. They created a space that felt open and grand. The rotunda was a marvel of engineering. There were no steel beams in those days. The support came from the masonry itself. Bricks and stones held each other up. The skill required to lay the bricks in a perfect circle was immense. The masons had to know exactly how much mortar to use. They had to know the angle of every brick. It was a job for masters of the trade. As the building climbed higher, the city around it changed. New streets were laid out, new houses were built. The common was turning from a grazing ground into a city park. The fence was built around the park boundary. It kept the animals out. The city hall was becoming the focal point of this new public space. The people of New York started to take pride in it. They walked by the site to see the progress. The year 1810 arrived. The exterior of the building was nearly complete. The roof was on, the windows were framed with glass, the marbles shone, the brownstones stood firm. But the work was far from over. The inside was still a rough shell. There were no floors, there were no ceilings. The rooms where the mayor and the aldermen would sit were empty. The finishing work remained. Finishing the inside was just as important as the outside walls. The inside rooms needed to be elegant. They needed to reflect the dignity of the government. The council hired wood carvers. They hired plasterers. These craftsmen added the details. They made decorative moldings. They built elegant staircases. The main staircase is a work of art. It curves upward from the entrance hall. It is made of mahogany wood. The wood was imported from the tropics. It was dark and rich. The staircase was a challenge to build. It had no central support. It hangs from the wall. This is called a cantilevered stair. Each step is locked into the wall. It takes a master carpenter to do this right. If the steps are not anchored perfectly, they will sag. The carpenters who built the City Hall staircase were experts. Their work has held up for 200 years. The work on the interior took another 2 years. The council chamber was the most important room. This is where the laws of the city would be made. The room was designed to be impressive. It had high ceilings. It had tall windows to let in light. The architects placed it in the center of the building. This gave it a sense of importance. Throughout this period, the tension between Macomb and Mangan continued. Mangan felt he was not getting credit. He was not being paid what he thought he deserved. He wrote letters to the council. He complained about Macomb. He accused Macomb of changing his designs. Macomb defended himself. He said he was making the changes to save money and ensure safety. The council mostly sided with Macomb. He was the one on the ground. He was the one solving the daily problems. By 1811, the building was essentially done. The exterior was complete. The roof was watertight. The interior rooms were finished. The cost had been high. The final price was much higher than the first estimate, but the city had its new heart. The building stood tall on the northern edge of the common. It was a mix of French design ideas and American building grit. The construction process had tested everyone. It tested the patience of the city council. It tested the skills of the workers. It tested the partnership of the architects. There were moments of despair. There were moments of joy when a difficult piece of stone fit perfectly. The result was a structure that was both beautiful and strange. It had a marble face and a brownstone back. It had a French rotunda and an American sense of practicality. The building was ready to be occupied. The officials packed their bags in the old Wall Street building. They prepared to move to the new location. The move was a symbol of the shift in power. The government was moving north, away from the business district. It was moving into a space designed for public service. The people watched the furniture being carted through the streets. They knew that history was being made.
In 1812, the scaffolding was gone. The noise of construction had faded. The new City Hall stood complete. It was time for the city to use its new heart. The mayor at that time was DeWitt Clinton. He was a man of great vision. He would later be famous for building the Erie Canal. But first, he had to move the government into the new building. The move was a quiet affair. Clerks carried boxes of papers. They carried inkwells and quills. They walked up the front steps and into the grand entrance. The first impression of the interior was breathtaking. Visitors walked through the doors and into the vestibule. Then they saw the rotunda. It rose up 3 stories high. The dome above let in soft light. The air inside was cool and still. It felt like a temple. The walls were smooth plaster. The floor was stone. It echoed with the footsteps of the first workers. This space was designed to make people feel small, but also proud. It was a space for the public. The building was not just an office. It was a piece of art. The style of the building was a mix. It did not look like one specific thing. It was a blend of 2 worlds. The base and the columns showed the influence of ancient Rome. This is called the classical style. It represents order and democracy. But the top of the building was different. It had a low, sloping roof. It had dormer windows. It had a delicate railing. This style came from the French Renaissance. It looked like the palaces of Paris. Why was the style a mix? The answer lies with the architects. Joseph-François Mangin was French. He brought the Parisian flair to the design. He loved the curving lines and the decorative roofs. John Macomb Jr. was American. He loved the strength and logic of Roman buildings. When they worked together, these 2 styles merged. The result was unique. It was not a copy of a European building. It was something new. It was an American building with a French twist. This blend of styles is what makes New York City Hall so special. The exterior design was full of meaning. The front of the building faces south. This was deliberate. The architects wanted the building to catch the sun all day. In the winter, the light would warm the stone. In the summer, the portico would provide shade. The columns in the front are called Corinthian columns. They are the most ornate of the Greek styles. They have leaves carved into the top, or capital. These leaves represent the city's growth. The white marble front was a statement. It told the world that New York was a city of culture and refinement. The brownstone back was a statement of practicality. It showed that the city was wise with its money. This contrast fascinated people. Some critics said it looked unfinished. They said a grand building should be marble on all sides. But the people of New York grew to love it. They saw it as a reflection of their own character. They were ambitious, but they were also practical. The building was honest. Just as important as the building was the land around it. The common began to change. The city wanted a fitting setting for their new marble gem. They hired a landscape designer. His name was Joseph Brown. He had a plan to turn the muddy grazing ground into a beautiful park. He wanted paths that wound through the grass. He wanted trees that provided shade. The work on the park, now called City Hall Park, moved forward. Workers planted rows of trees. They laid down gravel paths. They built a grand iron fence around the perimeter. This fence was a work of art itself. It was made of wrought iron. The posts were topped with gold balls. The fence defined the boundary. It said that this space was special. It was not just open land anymore. It was a civic space. The park became a place for the people. On hot summer days, families would walk the paths. They would sit on benches and look at the new city hall. The building sat on a small hill. This made it look even taller. It watched over the park like a guardian. The park became the stage, and the city hall was the backdrop. Public gatherings started to happen there. Political rallies took place under the trees. It was a place to see and be seen. Inside the building, one room stood out above the rest. This was the governor's room. When the building was planned, it was meant for the governor of New York State. The capital moved to Albany before the building was finished, so the room became a ceremonial hall for the mayor. It is a place of history. The room is decorated with portraits of important people. The city hired famous artists to paint these portraits. One of the artists was John Trumbull. He painted scenes of the American Revolution. Another was Samuel Waldo. He painted the heroes of the War of 1812. The walls of the governor's room became a gallery of American history. Walking through that room was like walking through the story of the nation. It reminded the officials who worked there of the legacy they had to uphold. The building also housed the courts. The courtroom was designed to look serious and fair. The judge sat on a high platform.
The jury box was to the side. The public sat in the back. The acoustics were designed so that everyone could hear. Justice was administered under the high ceiling of the new City Hall. It added a sense of weight to the law. The building itself said that the law was important. However, the story of the architecture is not without its shadows. The tension between Mongeon and Macomb did not end with construction. As the building opened, the question of credit arose. Who should be known as the architect? The city council had listed Macomb as the superintendent and Mongeon as the architect and the early records, but over time, Macomb became the face of the project. He was the one who handled the problems. He was the one who finished the job. Mongeon felt he was erased from history. He had drawn the beautiful shapes. He had created the unique floor plan. But because he was an immigrant, and because Macomb was the local favorite, the city favored Macomb. Mongeon tried to get recognition. He published his own drawings. He wrote to the newspapers. But the city had moved on. Macomb received more commissions. He became the most famous architect in New York. Mongeon faded into the background. It is a sad part of the story. The building stands as a monument to both men, but for a long time, only one name was remembered. Despite this personal controversy, the building became an instant landmark. It was the tallest structure in the city for a while. The cupola rose above all the rooftops. Ships in the harbor could see it. It became a navigation point. Sailors would look for the white dome in the cupola to find their way. It was a beacon of the city. It announced to the world that New York had arrived.